I don't know if you can hear that station in there, but that drove me crazy. See, I have this BC348 on the bench, and I did a video about it. I recommend it. It's one of the better radios. Once you're ready, you're past command radios and other kinds of radios. I would suggest you buy one of these. Now, this radio doesn't have the AM broadcast band per se. It has from 1500 up to 3.5 megahertz, which is the bottom of the ham radio band, 80 meters, and it does above that. Once you turn the selector, it'll do other bands. But I was shutting down the other night, or last night, and I heard this station. And I know you're probably not really into DX, but in other words, if you put your BFO on, you can detect the carrier. And let me just unplug this. I don't like leaving anything on that might start a fire while I'm doing a video. But in other words, when you're into DXing and you hear something like that, and you've got a carrier, you know there's a carrier there's an information, and then you sort of hunt around on the internet. Now, this dial hasn't been calibrated yet on this radio. It's very close, but it's saying it probably is right. It's saying 1680, and I read it as 1690, but it's really 1680. So you hear that, and I immediately grab my go-to radio, which is my DX390, and I keyed in 1690, couldn't find it. Got my other radios out, and then at some point, the music they're playing, it's a Hispanic station. I'm going up and down the dial on the other radio trying to find what the station is using the digital radio. And I made a mistake by 10 kilohertz, and I was off to the races. And when I got the Hispanic station from Lancaster, they were playing a similar song. Now, I don't know if you've ever listened to Hispanic music, but their drum beat is very similar from song to song to song. So I gave up last night, and I said, all right, what's going on is 1390 from the city is bleeding through. I don't have a station. What I have is some type of mixing problem, or the radio's got a weird IF. The IF is 915 kilohertz, so the oscillator's running at 2660 or something like that. So I'm laying in bed and I'm like, man, I never noticed a tube radio with a triple front end getting the wrong frequencies or images on the AM broadcast band. As you go up in frequency, that becomes very common on a single conversion radio. But here is a single conversion radio with a triple tune front end, my favorite radio. What's more favorite about it, it's got two tubes in the front end that are on at the same time on this radio. So it's very sensitive. We're talking better than 1 microvolt. So today I'm thinking about it. So let me go one more time. So I flipped this thing on. I'm sure, I unfurled my antenna through the house, and I'm picking it up pretty good. So now I'm thinking, okay, I'm off by so many megacycles with the frequency. So I get out my super radio, and my super radio is showing nothing, absolutely nothing in that high frequency band. So as I'm looking at it, I'm realizing the sound's really good on the super radio. Oh, I'm in wide, I'm not in narrow. So I go back and flip the switch on the super radio to make it narrow. And I'm going up and down, and it shows the frequency at 1650. And it's the station. I said, all right, super radio can get it. And that means it's not an image. So then I go back to the BC348, and there's a station. So then I get out my DX390, and I start going up and down, up and down. Now the DX390, the knob that you rotate, the encoder knob, that's starting to give me trouble. You know, this radio, I mean, I really wore that encoder out going up and down all the years I've had it. And then finally, I said, let me go down in frequency. And I looked, and I could just barely hear it. I mean, I'm sitting there, and of course, if you take the radio to another room of the house, away from the computers, it's a little more clearer. But to my amazement, was the BC348 kept up with the super radio. It actually it's in the same room, it's picking up more station. Now, the BC348 does have a wire going out of the room through the house where it's a lot more quiet. But to see a tube radio hold itself up against a tube radio hold up itself against a transistor radio, it's pretty impressive. And that's why I tell you, this radio, the BC348, if you're ready for it, this is a -R. It's got the tubes in the front end with the caps on the top, which are the grids. It's got 4 RF cans, not 3. So they made it because they didn't know what they really needed at the time. And then as the war progressed, they made a more economy version of the radio, which is not as sensitive. All right, it's not as good. It's by a tiny little amount, but they did use different tubes in it, which had more gain. So they were just at some point said this is good enough, and we can pump these out faster for the war effort. And when the newer BC348s were coming out, the war was almost over, type of thing. They were like, well, we're talking between aircraft, and most of the time it's radio silence. You know, so they weighed all the facts and they started pumping out a lesser version. But I love this type of front end, a triple tuned. There's, you know, you can see it right here. This is the giveaway. 3 boxes. Our front end, which is right off the antenna. Then you come in and you have a tube, this tube here, and then it goes to this one, which tunes to the frequency. Another tube, which amplifies it, goes to the mixer, gets tuned again, then it gets to the mixer tube itself, and here's the oscillator. So another way to spot that kind of radio, oh, and there's the IF cans. Let me make sure I'm in the frame. That's what you want. You want 4 IF cans if you can. 3 is good. And I also told you on one of my other videos that you look for a tuning capacitor that has 3 sections. And yeah, three sections. That's a good radio. Great radio. You'll see 4 sections. The 4th one is the oscillator. And they're padded. In other words, they pad them with different capacitors depending on what band you're on. That's the way that it rolls. I don't want to go into that rant where I start trying to explain to people that you can use a larger tuning capacitor when you don't really need a smaller one. You just put a series cap in it, and you'll get it works just like it's half the capacitance, 1/3 the capacitance. They do that in radios. That's a normal thing. I had guys argue with me, one of the groups, that causes a non-linearity problem. They were wrong. So anyway, I just want to tell you, this radio is really sensitive. All right, and that, you know, we're talking right down around 1 microvolt. And I kept thinking, well, is there any radio that's better than 1 microvolt? And I do have one. It's made from Japan, and it claims to be 0.5 microvolt sensitivity on the AM broadcast band. And that one there, it has more modern tubes in it, so you can do that. But in other words, I find that the radios with a lot of extra coils in the front end, it picks the station up, but it also removes noise. See, you can put a signal generator on it, on the antenna terminals of a radio, and it produces a certain amount of tone at the speaker, and it's a formula, and then they say the radio is 1 microvolt front end, but the signal to noise is important. See, when you have a radio that's triple tuned like this thing is, and it gets the signal into the speaker or through the audio amp, that's really something. So every time you tune with good coils, and I always say they have good Q. They're not tiny little coils. They're quite large, and the signal that comes through that gets through there. it's in the radio now. Once it comes through the antenna, it goes through this processing, and then it's in the radio. Unlike a software-defined radios, there's no coils in those things. So yes, when you hook an antenna up to it, you can put a tone on it, and you'll say, oh, it's 1 microvolt or 5 microvolt front end. But what's the noise? What's the signal to noise? So you can fool the public very easily. But these old radios, when they're recapped and running correctly and calibrated correctly, they're amazing. And I told you the story about how I used to fix old Zenith radios for the people at the lake. My father would bring it home, an old radio in the back of the car. He'd hand me the keys. I'd take it out, took it down the cellar, and I'd repair it. And the story was that these people had lake houses, and they were the only radios that worked. And everybody at that lake community would tell you the only radio that'll work up here is an old tube radio, and they didn't know why. And I got into it, and I found out the little portable Radio Shack, long distance radio, would work at that lake. And then people started switching over to that. But they were collecting these big consoles, 1937 radios, that had the extra stages. Because when they made radios back in those days, they had to be able to pick stuff up. See, if you're a radio salesman, there's no television, there's no internet, and you're selling somebody a radio, and back then, say it was $500. That's a lot of money in today's money. All right, let's say they were $275. But in other words, people wanted to turn that thing on and actually get stuff. And you could get other states. But then as time went on, everybody started getting local radio stations. And they didn't need a really sensitive radio. That's sensitivity now. I told you. Sensitivity, then the selectivity. So anyway, then as time progressed, people were happy with little tinny transistor radios that would get just the power rock and roll station in your area. And people were absolutely happy. But what happens is we got into the 60s. There was no internet. And ice hockey was becoming popular. And I showed all these people that a really good radio, they could listen to the hockey game up in Canada, which wasn't on television here, or in Pennsylvania or in New Jersey. And these guys would come in. Oh, it faded out a little bit, but I was able to follow the team. And, late at night, too, in the wintertime, when they're playing ice hockey, that's when the atmosphere is the best, too. So there was like a 5-year period where people were getting into hockey, old radios, and then all of a sudden cable TV came along. And they'd have some type of sports channel that would carry the hockey game. But radio several times has had resurgence, like shortwave. When we got in the first Middle East war, around 1984, my father had died, and right after, anyway, the shortwave store became very busy with people that wanted to get into picking up those stations from the Mideast and stuff like that. That was the last hurrah. And maybe the second Gulf War. I wasn't around the shortwave store at that time. I think, yeah, a guy had bought it, and it closed down. But in other words, certain things will happen in the world where suddenly people are interested in shortwave radios again. But this wasn't a ghost station or a harmonic or an image. This was an actual station last night. And the music they were playing, because I had another radio off to the side, I'm going through the stations. And the music, it seemed the same. And with that beat, I don't know if I get the Hispanic station from Lancaster City. And when I was doing the crystal radio set experiments, that was one of the stations I could pick up. I told you, I pick up stations during the day that are low power, that are far away. And then I can pick up a radio and tune one of those stations in and know how hot that radio is. I'll put the high end. Now down on the bottom end, I was using a station from Long Island during the day, not a DX. That station, the radio has the proper amount of selectivity, the right size antenna built into it. You can tune it in and you can pick up the Long Island station. So you know, if you got a good high end, which would be, I was using up until this point, I was using the 1600, which is Sweet 16. It's a low power rock and roll station. I use that for the top end, and then the Long Island one for the bottom. And you go through all your radios, and all of a sudden, a good percentage of your radios get the batteries taken out and put away. You're like, that doesn't pick up enough. But I just want to tell you, I had a page of math. I had the IF, the oscillator frequency, and I'm trying to mix it on the paperwork to get 1390, which is the station I thought was there, and it wasn't. It turned out to be another Hispanic station, which is in, I think it was, I wrote it down, Lindenwood, New Jersey. It's a Philly station. It's WTTM. It's a Philly station, but the transmitter is in New Jersey. And that became a little confusing because I put in 1680 Philly, and it kept coming up with a New Jersey station. But it services Philly, but the transmitter is in New Jersey. This is all the stuff you can go through. You can spend hours. Where you got a station, especially during the day, it's a low power, and a lot of them I get out of Maryland. And I had the ICOM R71 when I first got here. I built this giant box antenna, box loop, and I could control it from in this room here. And I could get these Maryland stations that service the corporate center down there. And a lot of music was flute stuff, really weird types of music, but it's background music for the companies that are there back then. That's 15 years ago. I don't know if any of that stuff's still around, but I do enjoy music, and I do enjoy finding stations. It frustrates me, it aggravates me, but I stay with it until I figure out what is going on. Because today I took a frequency reading of the oscillator using my DX390, and I'm trying to figure out on paper how that 1390 was getting up on that band. And that does happen with a bad radio or a cheap radio. But this thing's triple tuned front end, and now I'm like discouraged. And then finally, I was going back and forth between the 1390, which is in Lancaster, and this station here. And I noticed they were playing different music. Last night, they were playing that drum. I call it bongo Congo music. Every song's got the same drum beat, and it's Puerto Rican. It's very popular in Puerto Rico, and that's the music, and that's the music you hear here because Lancaster City is a big enclave of Puerto Ricans, and they all play certain stations. And when they go by, you hear the drum beat. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but and that's what I was getting last night. And I'm getting tired, and I'm like, this radio, I can't believe this radio is bleeding. I can't believe this radio is getting an image frequency. And then today I go, okay, let's go back and go through it step by step. And now that I look at the dial, I think it is correct. But anyway, that was my ghost radio station story. And that's what, when you get into DX and stations, DX at night, a station that's only 1,000 watts can be almost at the other end of the world, and it'll skip in certain nights, and you'll pick it up. That's DXing. And I was taught D stands for distance, and X is for unknown. And then the other day, I heard a guy say X is, extra distance. So DX is D for distance, and X is for extra. But the two Bobs on Radio Swiss International, he said D stands for distance, X, as in mathematics, stands for the unknown. Instead of distance, because D is distance, but extra, they're saying the X is extra distance. But Bob, I think, was right. D stands for distance, and the X stands for you don't know. When you're DXing, you don't know how far the station is away. But I think that's it. But I want to tell you, this BC348 would be my super favorite radio if it did the complete AM broadcast span. You know, it would be nice that it did 10 meter and short CB radio. That's my NC57. I might do a review on that. That really works good for AM broadcast DX. But on that one, on a lot of them, you have to switch to another band to go higher up on the AM broadcast band. And you get the signals much stronger. And some of it is another tube is kicked in when you go above AM broadcast, some radios bring another tube in, and it'll be stronger. And then some of it's just that your coil, you're not at the very end of the coil in the mixing section. The coil, it's a certain area where the coil, every coil will resonate really well. And as you go further and further with more capacitance to go lower in frequency, it won't be as pronounced or as sharp or as violent. If you ever looked at an oscillator with a scope, the coil will have an area when you tune in it where the sine wave gets bigger, and when you go higher in frequency, it goes down. When you go lower in frequency, it comes back up to middle and then goes back down, and that you can tell the sweet spot of the coil with that capacitor you're using. And you can work around that by changing the coil. But in a radio, you're at the very end of the dial, and old radios are 1500, 1550 at the end. And if there's a station up in there, the radio's starting to lose its oomph when you get to the top. AM radios lose the oomph when they go to the bottom. Anyway, that's what, if you're in radios, you're like, yeah, I understand that. But when you're doing the bottom end, the AM broadcast band, sometimes you could switch to your long wave band, and it has the bottom of it would be the bottom of the AM broadcast band there, and you tune up, and it's much louder because now you're in a coil that's near its sweet spot. So there's a lot involved. Some radios are really good in the middle band on the AM broadcast band, and then others they die at the bottom and they die at the top. And after you own enough of them and you remember the stations and you go looking for them, that's what I do. I have these stations in my head. If you hand me a radio, within a few minutes during the day, I can tell you the sensitivity at the top and the sensitivity at the bottom without using a signal generator. And a signal generator is misleading because it doesn't let you know the signal to noise. And if the company doesn't list that in their specs, you don't know. Because you can have a radio that picks up a half a microvolt signal, but it's buried in all this noise because there's no processing. That's where SDRs are really bad. An SDR radio is great for police bands, satellite frequencies, but as you go lower in the frequencies, your signal to noise gets greater. And as Shango did, he went out in the desert with an SDR radio, and he really thought a lot about that radio. And I was kind of chuckling because there's no front end on him. And he barely got the strongest station, one station, and that's how the ones I bought were. And people are like, oh, my SDR is really good. You don't know what a good radio is. I can tell right away when you start telling me the SDR is a really great radio. It is, compared to an old junk radio, and you're talking CB, anything from there up. Yeah, the old radio has trouble, right? Tubes, later on they perfected high frequency tubes, but it took a long time. And, a couple FETs blow the doors off a tube at higher frequencies. At lower frequencies, what comes into play are your coils. That's why you're like, why do these guys transistorize a BC348? That's because they like the coils that are in it. Yeah, high efficiency. I always say Q, and I have people go, well, you really shouldn't use the word Q. No, I say Q for quality. Q stands for quality. And but really, you should say the efficiency of the coil within that frequencies. It's better. You have to see it on the scope. Build some circuits, and as you're working your oscillator to do your project, you notice that as you turn it, the sine wave goes from low, peaks up in the middle, and then drops off. And that's it. And you don't need a lot of oscillator with the mixer, but you want it to stay consistent. So the AVC works correctly, automatic volume control. There's another one for AVC, automatic gain control. They use them interchangeably. It's very confusing when you first start out. There's a steep learning curve, but I just wanted to tell you about my Go station. I got it. I don't have to think about it anymore. I think that's it. All right, that's it.